the introduction there. Um, I have been in the medical device space now for a number of years, and I've been working principally in the last 5 or so years on software medical devices, active medical devices, and particularly life-saving therapeutic products. Um, and I've seen a whole host of innovation coming through the cycle. And one thing that I've really kind of seen within industry is that a lot of companies, particularly at the startup phase, that have not created or made a medical device before, haven't necessarily always considered their regulatory strategy or how they're actually going to get their product through regulators to market. So this presentation is very much focused on trying to plug that gap, particularly within the startup phase and people thinking about starting products, transferring technology from a research academic space into real world clinical use. So today we're going to take a look at a few different areas and topics. We'll start off with regulatory strategy as part of the overall medical device landscape and how that fits into development. We'll then take a look at two of the main medical device markets, which is the USA and the EU. We'll take a look at what is a regulatory strategy, how to identify what regulations might be applicable to you and to your product, and take a look at risk classifications as well, which form a really important part of the medical device regulatory framework. We'll then take a look at, with that regulation identified and with your risk identified, what are the key pathways and what are the potential costs associated with that? And then we'll finalize the presentation, taking a quick look at quality management systems, particularly as part of design and development, and a few tips for success. So throughout this presentation, if you've got any queries or questions that you want to raise, I'm more than happy to answer them at the end. So if you can raise in the chat box, Claudia will be reviewing those and we'll be asking questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about medical device development. So there are actually a few different considerations, not just regulatory, that you need to take a look at as part of your design and development planning. So within creating a medical device, there are really 4 key pillars that you'll want to really be considering from the outset and from your initial planning. These are the technical considerations, commercial, clinical, and regulatory. And they all interact with one another, and they can all impact one another as well. So if we take a look from the commercial perspective, the marketing claims can impact upon the regulatory evidence that you need and can also impact upon the evidence requirements to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. From a technical perspective, again, you can, with additional marketing claims or a change in the population that you're looking to treat or to use your medical device with, you can change some of the parameters of what actually needs to be developed, what needs to be designed. And from a clinical perspective, this is ultimately what does the end user need and want, and what benefit from a clinical perspective are we looking to provide from making this medical device and providing it to users. Given that we've got a few people within particularly the research space, one of the things to consider within medical devices is intellectual property. So a lot of researchers will be wanting to publish data, but intellectual property, you do want to consider whether it's wise to publish data and information about a product or an innovation prior to going through patent applications. So something to consider for people on the call today. So I'm going to focus mainly on regulatory today, and I'm going to be focusing on 2 main areas. So this is a quick, easy graph of MedTech markets by market size. So you can clearly see that Europe and the USA are by far the largest markets. And within the USA, there is one regulatory system. Within particularly the European Union, there is another regulation that fits across multiple different countries. The regulatory systems are quite different, and the regulations are different as well. But in a lot of cases, what you do within the design and development process, there is a lot of harmonization between regulators in what they expect in terms of the evidence and documentation information to submit to a regulator as part of that assessment and certification process necessary to legally sell a product or sell a medical device onto these two markets. So in the USA, we have one main federal agency, the FDA. They review product submissions. They audit companies and their quality management systems. They're responsible for the safety and effectiveness of the system and making sure that manufacturers are ensuring the safety of their products. When we take a look at the European Union, it's a little bit more fragmented. So we've got a few different types of institution that are involved. We've got the lawmakers at the European Commission. We've then got government organizations within each country called competent authorities, similar to the FDA, but with a slightly smaller scope of operation. And then we've also got auditing organizations, which are used primarily to assess quality system compliance and also product compliance. So there's a slightly different frame that the regulations have put in place and a slightly different way in which the assessments take place between the two. So within those markets, what are we taking a look at? First off, it's our regulatory strategy. So the first thing we want to do is really take a look at what actually is our product. We want to try and define its intended use, its intended purpose, the features and characteristics that make this product your product. From those product attributes, we can then take a look at what regulations does it need to meet? Is it a medical device? Is it a medicine? Is it something else? If it's a medical device, we can then take a look at what level of regulatory risk it is within the system. So it's something that I'll go into a little bit later in terms of the risk classifications from low risk to high risk and the difference in how regulators assess those products based upon the risk. Once we understand the risk, we can then take a look at the different regulatory pathways that are available. So what routes to market do we have, whether that requires a submission, whether that doesn't require a submission in some cases, and the level of evidence needed within a submission if one is needed. As part of the regulatory strategy, you also want to be considering what process requirements and technical requirements you need to meet. So by that, I will describe a little bit further later on this, but really what documentation information standards do you need to meet in order to demonstrate your device is safe and effective for its intended use, for its intended purpose. And that then forms part of the evidence generation that you need to generate to submit to regulators or to have in place for regulators to review if necessary. Key to this is that different countries have different regulations, and those different regulations come with different requirements. So if you're looking to sell a product into the USA, there are different requirements and different regulations compared to selling them into the European Union, which again, we'll cover off a little bit later. And it's really important to consider which markets you are going to be going into as your initial target market launch areas. You want to focus your efforts onto generating the evidence that you need for those initial target markets. And setting this at the start of the project is something that is really, really important because ultimately it forms part of the main project planning activities. And within the design and development process for your medical device, if you don't start documenting and creating the evidence that you need at the right points in time, it can be very difficult to go back and retrospectively look at why did I design it in that way? Why does it have those features? And looking to essentially reverse engineer your design. So early establishing of requirements and expectations is something that's really recommended. And moving on from that, regulatory risk can actually change based upon the product claims that you make. So I've got an example of this a little bit later where you can have one product and it can actually change based upon the claims that you make, what the regulatory risk is and what the regulatory pathways come from it. And this is an area that some companies really skip at their peril. So we do see that a lot of startups come to us at a stage where they're interacting with regulators and saying, we don't understand what's being asked of us. We haven't done what's being asked of us. Help us. Ultimately, those manufacturers will have to look at how they can generate evidence to meet requirements. And in some cases, that means backtracking within the design stage to do additional tests. And in some cases, even to consider redesigning aspects of the product to meet compliance requirements. So I'll move on to the first thing, which product regulations? I've got an example here of a chemical called chlorhexidine gluconate. It's used quite extensively within the medical industries because it's got really good antimicrobial and disinfection properties. So it's actually used within various different types of products. And depending upon what claims you make and what type of product it is, it can fit into multiple regulations. So I've got an example here of European regulations where if you integrate it into a mouthwash and no antimicrobial claims are made, it's a cosmetic product. But as soon as you start making an antimicrobial effect claim, it becomes a medicinal product, so a drug. We can also look at this integrated into different types of wipe. So a cleaning wipe in the European Union, you create what's called a biocide product. If you integrate it into a surgical skin wipe to prepare skin before surgery, it becomes a medical device. And if you integrate that same chemical into a wound dressing, because it has that antimicrobial effect, it's a medical device and medicinal product, what's called a combination product. So just that one chemical can have multiple different uses and actually fit into multiple different types of regulation. So it's really important up front to understand what your product is, what your claims are, and how that fits into the medical device ecosystem. So we need to ask ourselves, actually, what is a medical device and is our product one of those? So I've got here the European definition for medical device. The US definition is quite similar, but not as specific. But really what it's taking a look at here is medical purposes for use on people, either a physical item or a piece of software, particularly used as part of diagnosis, treatment, monitoring of conditions, replacement of anatomy, and various other different indications. One of the key things within both regulations is that drugs are not included within medical devices unless the primary mode of action is physical rather than chemical. So, for example, you can have a medical device which has a medicine integrated, and depending upon which is the primary function of the product, will depend on which regulation it fits into, both in the US and in the European Union. So I mentioned earlier about device risk and particularly the impact of claims. So this example takes a look at a medical scalpel. And this medical scalpel, in all cases, is potentially exactly the same product. We are making different claims on that same product. So the first one is cutting into paper. It doesn't actually have a medical purpose, and so it's not a medical device. We can also use that for low risk uses, shaving hair as part of surgical preparations. We can have that same product used for slightly more invasive procedures. We can cut into skin, and that increases the risk classification up higher because the level of regulatory risk has increased because the level of potential patient harm has increased. And then we can also potentially take this same product from not being a medical device into being a high-risk medical device, the highest risk possible, by claiming that it can cut into brain tissue. And again, here, the risk increases from a clinical perspective, from a patient risk perspective. So the regulator is expecting more rigor in the way the product has been designed and more evidence to prove that that product works as intended for its intended purpose, for the intended patient population that you have claimed it is to be used with. And I'll continue using this example on the next slide. So the US and the European system have two slightly different ways of identifying what the level of risk is. So the European system uses what's called a rules-based classification system. So using that same example that we were taking a look at before for medical devices, shaving hair comes under what's called Rule 1. And this is essentially a rule for all devices that don't fit into other categories. It also comes under two parts of Rule 6 within the European system. So Rule 6 looks at surgically invasive devices, unless another category within that rule applies, which is where Class 3 comes in for cutting into brain tissue. So because you're cutting into brain tissue, you are in direct contact with the central nervous system. And that then takes you into that higher risk classification because you meet that rules requirement within the European system. The US does things a little bit differently. They classify products based around the type of product. So every type of product has a code associated with it. And that code is linked to what FDA considers to be the right regulatory requirements and the right submission requirements for that product type. So as an example here, we take a look at medical devices that are used in radiology and particularly part of mammography scanning. So we have the potential here to use and create a product which is a medical imaging communication device. It's US Class 1, it's 510(k) exempt. So it doesn't need to go through a formal submission to the FDA before it can be released and used by patients. It has limitations to what you can do within that product. So you can't perform advanced image processing. If you want to perform that advanced image processing, you need to move up to another product code, which is Class 2 and requires a 510(k). So we've moved from a low risk product to a higher risk product or medium risk. And this medium risk product, as a radiological image processing software for radiation therapy, has potentially a much larger use case, and potentially you can, as a business, make a stronger commercial claim on this product because it has a better function in terms of its clinical benefit and its purpose. You could potentially, as a business, make more money from it through reimbursement. And then we've also got a potential Class 3 product within this area as well. So Class 3 products in the US require what's called a PMA in most cases, pre-market approval, which is the highest classification of medical device and the most difficult regulatory pathway to go through in the US. And this is an example of a product that's actually been classified many years ago. And in some cases, you may find that the US system does create some interesting contradictions. So this particular product here is used as part of mammography scanning as an additional product alongside general X-rays and radiological imaging. But there are other products which have been placed on the market after this in the US, which are Class 2 going through a 510(k) route. So it's not always obvious that a product has a higher level of risk through just taking a look at the product. You do need to take a look at which particular product code you fit into, based upon your intended use and indications for use. And your product might need to be modified in terms of its fit to be able to appropriately move into existing categories. So taking a look at common regulatory pathways here. So on the left of the slide, we've got US routes, and on the right of the slide, we've got the European routes, looking at low risk, medium risk, and high risk. So in the US, most products are exempt from requiring a 510K. So by that, I mean more than 50% of products on the US market. And generally, those are low risk devices, or they are medium risk devices, which FDA doesn't believe need to have a regulatory submission to them. So 510K exempt. There are, however, three main submission routes in the US, which is via the 510K route. So the majority of products go through that. The PMA route, which is reserved for the highest risk devices, generally devices which are either invasive or used as part of life-saving therapies or diagnoses. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but generally that's where high-risk devices sit that require PMA. We've also got an interesting category that only exists really in the US called de novo. And this is where there isn't currently an existing product code which fits for a product that's being evaluated. And that product's not expected to be a very high risk use. So it goes through its own classification assessment. And that de novo process is a bit more onerous than the 510K process, but provides you with the ability to create your own new product code. So your own new class of product within the US regulatory system. So potentially for novel products, the de novo route might be the way that you need to go to submit a medium risk product. In the European Union, we really have two main assessment processes. One for low risk devices, which is called self-certification. So that's similar to low risk devices and 510K exempt devices in the US, and medium and high risk devices that require what's called a notified body assessment. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later, but essentially it's the regulator's review, like the FDA, of the product, but also of the quality management system of the manufacturer that's making that product. So I'll focus in on the 510K process for the US because that's the most commonly used submission route. And I believe a few people on the call today are considering whether their product needs to go through the 510K route for their product submission. So if we take a look at the 510K route, the aim is to demonstrate what's called substantial equivalence to an existing marketed device in the USA. So you are looking to show that your product is comparable to another product. And FDA have quite a clear set of guidance on how to do that, what documentation to present, and how to appropriately assess that. And in most cases, the FDA will be relatively upfront with you if they don't believe that the pathway is appropriate. So one of the things to consider before you go through your submissions to FDA is to do what's called a pre-submission. So you can ask FDA specific questions, like, for instance, I have this product, I am intending to use this predicate. Do you believe this predicate is suitable? You obviously need to have supporting evidence behind why you're putting those questions to FDA. But it does tend to be a way of de-risking the regulatory process in the USA, which is not available in the EU or most other countries. So make use of it. and it's a free service as well provided by FDA at the moment. So demonstrating substantial equivalence, really what you are looking to do is to compare your product against an existing similar product. You're looking at the similarities and difference in terms of the clinical, technical, and design characteristics, and you're looking to demonstrate that there are no new questions of safety and effectiveness raised by your product. So generally speaking, that is looking at demonstrating no new hazard types exist for your product that are potentially serious and difficult for the FDA to agree to as part of the submission process. And this is where novelty can be a problem. So the process is really looking at how similar you are to an existing product. So novelty can sometimes be difficult to get through the 510K process. It can sometimes be reasonably straightforward to go through the 510K process. And this is where, particularly where you've got novel or novelty in your device or your technology, it's really worth speaking with FDA about your submission route before you go down it, because you may well find that there are routes that you can use to go down a 510K route, or that FDA potentially doesn't want you to go down a 510K route and considers you do need to go down a de novo route. Regulatory pathway in the EU is a little bit different. So within the European Union, there are multiple regulatory bodies called notified bodies. So you as a business can pick and choose which notified body you want. And currently there are around 40 which you can pick from. And this notified body is what's called a commercial organization that is appointed by the European regulators to assess products on their behalf. And they are looking at both the product compliance and the quality management system compliance, which is one of the big differences in the certification process between Europe and the USA. So in the USA, you do not require certification of your quality management system. You do generally require one to be in place, and it can be audited by FDA, but generally that is either after you have gone on the market for cause, or it is as part of routine assessments by FDA. Whereas in the European Union, there is a consistent process of auditing generally at least once a year after you have got your initial certifications in place. The other key difference in the European process, which is currently a bit of an issue, is around approval timelines. So I'll just move on to the next slide for that. So generally, if we're taking a look at the USA and a class 2 product going through 510K, around about 6 months is the average time from the initial submission through to an approval. If we take a look at the European process, that increases up to about 1 year to 1.5 years. So quite a considerable increase in time, and also quite a significant difference in terms of the fees, where particularly as small businesses generally will be the people on this call, or startups or spin-outs, the submission costs are actually quite low for FDA, but are quite significantly higher for medium and high risk products going into the European Union. A little word quickly on QMSs now. So it's one of the things that we discussed earlier as being a requirement in Europe. It's also a requirement in the US in most cases. And quality management systems become the backbone to how to appropriately develop and design a medical device, and how to ensure that you are documenting the right things at the right times through systematic processes. And really the regulators are expecting, and in a lot of cases requiring, you to have a quality management system to control that design process, to control and make sure that you are developing safe and effective products. And the main method that is used around the world is a ISO standard called ISO 13485, covering quality management systems for medical devices. And there was a publication around about a week ago where FDA have committed to harmonizing US regulations to match the requirements of ISO 13485. An important consideration here is, if people have heard about this, is that this is a new rule created by FDA, and the existing requirements are still effective for the next 2 years. So if you're looking at commercializing a product in the next 2 years, you still need to follow the existing FDA requirements. ISO 13485 as a standard will not cover you. You will still need to meet the current FDA requirements. So just something to bear in mind within your strategy and planning as well, if you were thinking of going down an ISO 13485 route. Within each country that you sell into, ISO 13485 has what's called applicable regulatory requirements. So this is where you need to build into your system how you interact with regulators from a commercial and from a development perspective to submit your products, to have them assessed if necessary, and to make sure that you have the right systems in place to report any issues that customers and patients have experienced, and any recalls, corrections, or other product faults that you're looking to fix. I'm now going to move on to a few tips. So first one's really early engagement. Make sure that you're understanding what the regulatory strategy is for your device. Second one, quality management system. Make sure that you've got one in place that you're designing and developing within that system, particularly for medium and high risk products, which require you to have a quality management system and require you to have what's called design controls within that system. Upfront, try and identify what product standards you need to meet. So within medical devices, because the underlying technologies, particularly for electronic and physical products, are now quite well characterized in terms of the science. We know for a lot of products what is that baseline level of safety that's necessary for particular product types. So for example, a catheter may have particular requirements for it. A medical device which includes electronics which come into contact with the patient also has basic levels of safety which are set through standards. And regulators will generally expect you to meet those standards because they have assessed and determined that those standards meet their requirements in applying the regulations. The last point on this slide is really about upfront regulatory deliverables assessment. So knowing at the start of the project, what do we need to create to meet regulators' expectations? So a lot of companies will start off in their design and development process and won't necessarily consider what do we actually need to achieve as endpoints within our development process? What documentation do we need to generate? When do we need to generate it? What resources and requirements do we need to do to meet and to make that evidence? That's one to take a look up front within your project planning. Particularly with spin-outs and startups, there will almost inevitably be design changes to specification, changes to even the product, and to pivot to making a different product. So if you are changing your product during the development phase, make sure you're taking a look at, does this have an impact on the regulatory strategy that I've set? Am I, say, for instance, making new claims which affects the pathway? Or am I changing the technology in a way that takes me from one FDA product code into another FDA product code? These are all things that you consider as part of that development process when you make a change. And within the project planning, really try to include in that initial project planning what the timelines are you expect between submission and regulatory approval. So a lot of companies will have plans to, say, for instance, immediately launch their product after they've submitted, not necessarily realizing that there is a 6 month wait between having finished verifying your product and generating all of the evidence and having the approval to sell. And that 6 month time frame for a lot of companies will be a difficult bridge if they've not considered it up front. A few tips on medical device markets. So the key one is that at the moment, the USA is often the easier market compared to the European Union. The main benefit of the European Union and CE marking is that it can get you into more territories, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, than the US regulations can get you into. So both FDA and CE mark are considered to be two of the gold standard medical device assessments. So are accepted in many other countries around the world, either as a reference to say you meet the US or the EU's requirements, therefore you can sell your product in our country, or to reduce the regulatory assessment timeframe quite significantly, and reduce the amount of review time necessary to go into other markets. So, for instance, in Australia, you can get into the Australian market generally in around about 3 to 4 weeks if you have a CE mark. If you don't, you need to go through an alternative process, and it will tend to take 6 to 12 months. So, understanding what passports your regulatory approvals give you into different territories, particularly EU and US product approvals, they can really open the door to many other different countries outside of the countries that you get the initial approval in. Another key consideration is really around commercial strategy. So making sure your commercial strategy aligns with your regulatory strategy. So particularly in the US, reimbursement can be an interesting issue. I've been involved in a number of products where product claims have had to change in order to meet certain reimbursement codes for practitioners and doctors to be paid for using the product. So it's an important consideration within your planning for commercial to make sure that your commercial strategy is actually aligning with the claims that you want to make, and those claims are aligning with your regulatory strategy to make sure that you can get the most commercial bang for your buck for your customers, and then also hopefully for your sales. And then just a last summary. So key takeaways: start early. So making sure that you're taking a look in project planning at defining your regulatory strategy and making sure your regulatory strategy fits with your technical, commercial, clinical strategies as well. Making sure you're identifying the applicable regulations that you need to follow is incredibly important, because that will then identify the regulatory pathway that you need to follow as well. And last but not least, it's around within the development process, identifying what deliverables you need within your product development in order to meet regulators' expectations. So that draws to an end my presentation. So hopefully that was helpful and informative for people.
That was great. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a great discussion on regulatory strategy. Before we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to point out that we've put some regulatory assistance resources for OHSU affiliated investigators in the chat box. As we begin Q&A, please feel free to keep adding those questions into the chat feature located in the middle of the bottom ribbon of your screen. And any questions that we can't get to during the webinar will be addressed in a follow-on email. So, Tim, are you ready? Got a couple.
Yep, ready to go.
Alrighty. Okay. So the first one: if a device is implantable and therefore class 3, in the US system, might it still be eligible for a 510(k) process if it is based upon existing approved components?
Ooh, that is an interesting question. So in the US, generally, a long-term implantable product is usually class 3, but there are some exceptions to that. So again, it's worth taking a look at the FDA product codes that your product will fit into. If there are existing products on the market, those will identify whether you are class 3 and need to go through a PMA, or whether you're class 2 and can go through a 510(k) route.
Great.
So the specifics are important, but we don't have the specifics to talk about here.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question, you actually did a great job of hitting some of it, but I think there's a question within it that I think we can discuss more. So it's tips for identifying a strategy around whether to pursue a US and or EU regulatory pathway. So should an investigator, should they attempt to do it simultaneously, like, or do them in sequence?
Oh,
So
that's an
what?
interesting question. So it will depend upon the level of investment and what your go-to-market strategy is. So to a large extent, um, the regulations will dictate the level of effort that you need. And in some cases, you may choose to go into the US because there's a lower regulatory bar, or into the EU because is a lower regulatory bar. So it's easier to get that initial market adoption. But underpinning the regulations is really, once you've got a product legally able to sell, you need to have all of the infrastructure in place to be able to commercially sell your product. So that's just as an important an area to take a look at within your go-to-market strategy. So making sure that you have the distributors in place, that you know how you're going to get your product to the market, to sell it, to get business revenue, etc.
So if someone is considering to eventually do both, is there a way to do that in concert and therefore
Um,
not double efforts? Or
yes, so there very much is. So you'll find that for a lot of products, the core regulatory evidence that you need will be quite similar. So if you are looking at going into both markets at a similar time, um, you can put together your development strategy to meet the requirements of both territories at the same time. Generally, that needs a little bit more effort than just going for one territory at one time. But in a lot of cases, you'll be surprised that there is not as much effort necessary to go into both markets at the same time from a product perspective. The main key difference is on quality management systems, where because in the European Union you need a formal certification of the system if you're a medium or high risk device. That adds on quite a bit of additional overhead internally in terms of your resource, but also in terms of cost as well.
okay, great. And then there's I think you touched on the rest of this question, reasons we might only pursue one regulatory market over the other. Okay, why might we pursue both markets? Yeah, I think that you touched on both of those points. I don't know if you have anything additional to say.
Yeah, so perhaps an example from when I was in industry. So I was at a company that produced medical ventilators, and we were principally in the European Union and most other countries around the world. But one country that we didn't go into was the US. And we didn't go into the US because our product was classed as being a PMA product. So class 3 requiring essentially millions of dollars worth of investment to get onto the US market. So we made the commercial and strategic decision that we wouldn't go to the US market because the regulatory barriers were so high for our product type.
Right. Somebody asked, what system does Canada employ?
So Canada has a system that is similar to the European Union, but with some differences. So they have a similar rules-based classification system, and and their requirements are less formally defined than in the European Union. And that allows them to take submission evidence from European companies that principally meet CE marking requirements, but also US companies that principally meet FDA requirements. So they've got a system that's kind of balanced between the two, but is more similar to the European system.
Interesting. Okay, well, actually, we went ahead and got through all of the Q&A questions. Thank you again to Timothy Bubb from IMed Consultancy. I believe there's contact information on your last slide if anyone would like to reach out with additional questions. I want to thank everyone who attended today. The recording for this webinar will be available soon and distributed to all registrants.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for joining us.